Kentucky, 1842. The sun hung like a burning coin in the noonday sky, casting long shadows across the scorched rows of tobacco. Flies swarmed thick around open wounds. Sweat dripped down backs already slick with it. The air was heavy, hot as the iron pots that hung over slave cabin fires and just as unforgiving. Every breath tasted of soil, leather, and blood. And the sound, the ever-present sound, was the whip. Not a sharp crack like thunder, but a cruel rhythm that rolled like drums through the fields. It carved its way through corn stalks and tobacco leaves, announcing punishment, correcting posture, breaking spirits. It was the song of the plantation. It didn't matter if you were 6 or 60, if your hoe slowed, if your eyes wandered, if your body broke down, the whip answered. And when it spoke, it licked flesh like flame. A scream followed the next lash, muffled but clear. No one looked. Looking meant caring. Caring got you noticed, and getting noticed on the Hayworth plantation meant suffering. Isaiah Fields didn't flinch. He stood among the cutters, shirtless, his dark skin baked into dusk by the sun and scarred like the bark of a tree that's survived lightning. His hands were rough, wide, and wrapped tight around a wooden handle. Each swing of his blade was slow, measured, as though he were harvesting time itself. He didn't speak. He never did. Not unless the white man asked something directly, and even then only in nods or one-word replies. But they watched him. The overseers, 4 of them now since the last one disappeared. They kept their eyes on him like he was a mule with teeth. Isaiah was too strong, too still, too silent. He never cried when lashed, never ran when chased, never begged when cornered. And that frightened them more than rebellion ever could. Isaiah's back bore the proof of their fear, cross-hatched scars, old and new, laid in every direction like a map of suffering carved by the hands of cowards. But none were worse than the one that ran from his left shoulder blade down to his hip, a jagged rope of ruined flesh. That one he carried not just on his skin, but in his soul. It was his brother's death wound. 12 years earlier, on the same stretch of field, his younger brother Samuel had collapsed from heat exhaustion during harvest. The overseers hadn't let up. Instead, they'd accused him of malingering, dragging him up with one hand and whipping him down with the other. The boy's cries had echoed until they stopped suddenly, and when they stopped, the whip hadn't. Isaiah, just 20 at the time, had been held down by 2 other men as he watched the light go out of Samuel's eyes. The overseer, Briggs, had muttered a Bible verse while swinging, "Spare the rod, spoil the child." The other slaves were ordered to bury Samuel in the woods that night. No marker, no prayer, no mourning. Isaiah hadn't spoken a word since. But every stroke of his hoe, every basket he carried, every scar that healed wrong, it all layered upon a silence that grew denser, hotter, and more dangerous. The elders whispered that Isaiah's spirit hadn't broken. It had just gone underground like fire in dry roots, waiting for wind. The wind came in many forms on the Hayworth plantation. It came in overseers drunk on bourbon and cruelty. It came in masters who called their slaves children in public and beat them in private. But most of all, it came in the whip. Always the whip. Each overseer had their own, custom-made, some knotted, some barbed, some oiled daily like prize dogs. They named them. Harlan's was called Red Joy. Calloway's Snakebite. Denton's had no name, but its tip was notched with tiny teeth, bone shards of deer, they said. They didn't just use the whip, they believed in it. They spoke of it like a gospel, a tool that kept order, bred gratitude, and civilized the savage. But the slaves knew the truth. The whip was never a tool. It was a flag, a declaration of power. A symbol of who owned whose skin. A reminder that silence could be demanded by force. But Isaiah's silence didn't come from fear. It came from something else. Something darker. Something coiled. When he passed the whipping post at dawn, his eyes lingered just a second too long. When a fellow slave flinched from a crack nearby, Isaiah didn't blink. When the young ones were forced to watch another punishment, Isaiah's hands flexed, but his face stayed still, like carved obsidian. He wasn't waiting for freedom. He was waiting for the reckoning. And though the white men prided themselves on breaking spirits, none of them saw the flaw in their system. When you kill a man's brother, beat him to silence, and teach him the language of violence through scars, you may not break him. You may forge him. They called that part of the plantation the gallows fields. Not officially. On paper, it was Field Sector 3, a stretch of clay-red soil near the swamp line, where tobacco refused to grow tall and everything always seemed damp, as if the earth itself was trying to bleed something out. But the slaves had another name for it, because that field had taken more breath than it had ever given. And standing watch over it, like 4 devils in human skin, were the overseers. Calloway was the youngest. Barely 30, freckled, red-haired, and laughing too easily. His whip was short, fast, and cruel, named Snakebite, and he liked to make examples. Boys, girls, elders, it didn't matter. To Calloway, flesh was clay, and every scar he left was a signature. He didn't just whip, he performed. He'd grin as he paced, shirt untucked, boots always muddy. Before he struck, he'd say something clever like, "This here's a lesson in obedience, y'all. Watch close now." And then he'd lash 5, 10, 20 times without breaking rhythm. If someone cried too early, he'd stop and say, "Oh, we ain't even started." He was the kind of man who would whistle while cutting a man's back open. He wasn't feared for his size. He was small, wiry, but for his pleasure in cruelty. His joy made it worse. Harlan was twice Calloway's size and twice his age. Bald head, leather apron, a gut hanging heavy over his belt. He didn't walk, he lurched, and he always smelled like sour corn liquor and sweat. His whip was thick and stained, called Red Joy. It didn't snap, it thudded like wet meat against a post. He liked to whip until skin peeled in ribbons. Never counted strokes, never looked at faces. Just grunted, spat, and swung. If he was drunk enough, he'd sing. If he was sober, he'd cry. But no matter his state, Harlan never hesitated. He whipped because it was his duty, because it was expected, because no one ever taught him another way. Sometimes after a whipping, he'd vomit behind the barn, wiping his mouth with a bloody rag. Then he'd come back for more. The slaves didn't hate him the way they hated Calloway, but they feared him more. Harlan didn't feel like a man. He felt like a machine built for pain. Briggs was lean, tall, and always wore black gloves, black coat, black hat. He quoted scripture before he beat you, sometimes during. He called the whip his rod of righteousness, and it was braided tight and narrow, ideal for cutting across the face. He liked the sound it made when it zipped through air, like the hiss of a serpent hiding behind God's name. Before each punishment, he'd recite, "He that spareth his rod hateth his son. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves." Then he'd lash without blinking, eyes full of divine fire, mouth moving in silent prayer. Slaves whispered he once had a black mistress and a child, that he'd whipped them both to death to prove his loyalty to the plantation. No one knew if it was true, but it felt true. Briggs always looked like a man wrestling with something unholy inside, and losing. But the worst of them all was Denton. He didn't talk, didn't quote scripture, didn't joke, didn't drink. He just watched. And when it was time, he acted with a whip that seemed to appear out of nowhere, as if summoned from shadow. His lashes were deliberate, placed like the strokes of an artist, always aiming where it hurt most. Back of knees, neck, spine. It was Denton who gave Isaiah his worst scar, 12 years back. Isaiah had tried to shield Samuel, his brother, from a beating. Denton had said nothing. Just stepped forward, pulled back his coat, and lashed Isaiah until his shirt fused with his skin. Isaiah hadn't screamed. That was the part Denton remembered, and perhaps the part that haunted him. He never went near Isaiah again without a weapon in hand. The 4 overseers didn't operate alone. They rotated. Punishments were passed between them like ritual. Calloway started it, called the charge, mocked the accused. Harlan warmed up the flesh with heavy strokes. Briggs delivered God's will, and Denton ended it in silence. It wasn't discipline. It was theater, a message carved into muscle and memory. Sometimes they beat just to remind the slaves who held the whip. No cause needed. No resistance required. Just the cycle of fear turning like a millstone, grinding souls into silence. Isaiah Fields never begged. He obeyed orders. He worked dawn to dusk. He never missed roll call. Never stole. Never looked a white man in the eye unless told to, but he was always watching. His eyes followed the overseers, memorized their patterns. He knew where Calloway hid his flask, where Briggs kept his key ring, when Harlan passed out near the barn. When Denton walked the perimeter alone, and he listened. To the stories passed in whispers under cabin roofs, to the old songs about freedom hidden in the lyrics of work chants, to the warnings from the elders who still believed in spirits and signs. They said Isaiah had the mark. One old woman, blind in both eyes, once touched his hand and gasped, "This one done died already, vengeance just wearing his skin now." Some believed Isaiah spoke to ghosts, that he'd swallowed his brother's soul and it was still screaming inside him. Children were warned, don't stand too near Isaiah. Storms follow him. Even the whip-hand men began to sense it. One night, Briggs caught Isaiah staring at a tree stump, unmoving for hours. When asked why, Isaiah simply said, "Just counting how deep roots go." He wasn't talking about trees. In the gallows fields, 4 men held the whips. But deep in the shadows, beneath the soil and sweat, Isaiah Fields held something older. He held memory. And soon he would return the favor. The sun had barely risen when they dragged the boy to the whipping post. He couldn't have been more than 14. Barefoot, bones visible through too loose skin. His name was Elijah, though the white men never used it. They just called him boy like all the rest until age or disobedience earned them something worse. The charge. Theft! A crust of bread from the smokehouse, already hard as bark. Someone had seen him nibbling it in the shadows of the slop trough. Briggs had said, "Let's teach the rest what hunger costs." Calloway grinned. "Ain't nothing like a morning sermon." Elijah was trembling as they tied him to the post, and the lash began. Snakebite, Calloway's whip was fast and thin. It didn't tear at once. It sharpened its pain, carving a red script down the back of a child still growing into his bones. The field workers tried not to look. The air grew thick with the boys' shrieks, so high they pitched into silence. Every blow was a note in a song Isaiah had heard before, once upon a time when Samuel had screamed just like that. Isaiah dropped his hoe. He stepped forward once, then again. Calloway looked up, still swinging. "You want a taste too, scar back." Isaiah didn't speak. Didn't have to. He moved closer, closer than a slave ever should. The crowd stopped pretending to work. Harlan reached for Red Joy. Denton stood up from the wagon wheel. Briggs tilted his head and muttered, "Pride goeth before destruction." And then Isaiah reached for the post, for the knot. Calloway shoved him hard, spitting, "Back to line, boy." Isaiah didn't raise his fists, didn't argue, but he didn't move either. So they whipped him. Briggs gave the order. Denton did the honors. Thick leather across his chest, shoulders, back. They lashed until his shirt split, his flesh opened, and blood soaked down his pants like dark water. Isaiah made no sound, even as blood slicked his ribs. Even as he dropped to one knee, he stared at Calloway the whole time. When they were done, Calloway crouched near him and hissed through a smile, "You remember your brother, don't you? What was his name, Simon?" "Sammy." Isaiah didn't answer. Calloway leaned closer. "Yeah, that one. The one I broke like a mule, back when I first came up from Georgia. Hell, your face looked just like his when I flayed him open." He laughed and stood. "Two birds with one stone, huh?" The other overseers chuckled. Harlan muttered. Dumb bastard's been waiting 12 years just to get his back whipped again. Denton wiped blood from his whip and said nothing. That night the cabins were quiet. Isaiah lay on his mat, shirtless, wound still weeping. Across the fire, Elijah whimpered softly. The boy had survived. Barely, but he would not walk right for weeks. No one spoke of what happened. But they watched Isaiah. His hands were moving, even in the dark, carving. He had pulled a chunk of cedar wood from the firewood pile. Now he sat on the dirt floor, slowly shaping it with a bone-handled blade handed down from his grandfather, a slave who'd once served as a coffin maker. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. He carved deep and slow, lips moving in silence. Some said he was praying. Others said he was whispering to Samuel. Still others claimed he was speaking to the dead, not one, but all the ones whipped and buried without names, bones turned to dust beneath the fields. By morning, word had already spread through the quarters like smoke. The whips will remember. That's what Isaiah had said to a passing stable hand at dawn. Just those 4 words. No one saw him eat breakfast. No one saw him speak again, but they saw what he left behind. A carved wooden figure, smoothed by palm and sweat, shaped like a man hanging upside down, limbs twisted, spine curved like a whip. It sat in the dirt outside his cabin door. Calloway came by mid-morning, kicked it over, laughed. "What's this, hoodoo?" he spat. "Y'all trying to scare me with sticks and stories." Isaiah stood nearby, eyes fixed on the broken carving. Not Calloway. Briggs saw it too and frowned. He muttered a prayer under his breath and walked away. By sundown, even the children knew Isaiah wasn't just a man anymore. He was a storm walking upright. Back in the fields, Calloway made sure to walk behind him. Too close. Too loud. And when he spoke next, it was to remind everyone loudly, "That brother of yours died like he lived, soft. You trying to follow him, Isaiah? You gonna die soft too." Isaiah's hoe didn't stop moving. But the way it struck earth, sharp, deep, deliberate, sounded less like work and more like digging a grave. The fields lay under a black sky, only the stars blinking faint like eyes shut too long. A thick mist crept in from the lowland swamps, curling between tobacco rose like ghost breath. It was the kind of night the slaves feared, and the kind Isaiah had waited for. His shirt was stripped, his skin wrapped in rags and ash. His wound still raw, reopened beneath the weight of rope and rage. In his hands he carried nothing but silence and 4 coiled whips. Each one stolen. Each one marked. Each one named. He was walking back drunk from the barn, chuckling to himself, bottles swinging from one hand, snakebite hanging from his hip. The same whip that had torn open boys, flayed girls, and made music of pain. He didn't see Isaiah rise from the stalks. Didn't feel the noose slip over his head. By the time the whip tightened, Calloway's laughter choked into a gargle. Isaiah dragged him back into the field, feet scraping furrows in the dirt. The whip cut into his throat like it belonged there, barbed ends biting deep. He fought, clawed. Kicked. Isaiah said nothing. When Calloway's eyes bulged like bruised peaches and his legs stopped twitching, Isaiah let him drop. He unhooked Snakebite from the corpse's belt and whispered, "You made music. Now it sings you." Then he vanished into the mist again. He was asleep behind the feed shed, mouth open, snoring like thunder. His whip, Red Joy, lay across his lap like a sleeping dog. Isaiah stepped barefoot through the straw, the fog clinging to his limbs like a second skin. He wrapped Red Joy tight around Harlan's thick wrist and yanked. The old man woke with a shout. But Isaiah was already pulling, dragging him across the dirt like a sack of meat. Harlan screamed, cursed, tried to rise, but the whip was around his arm, around his shoulder, digging deep, slicing skin. Then snap, the sound of tendon tearing. Isaiah twisted harder. The arm popped free at the socket, flesh ripping like boiled leather. Harlan howled once, then choked, then stilled. His body slumped in a trail of blood and torn hay. Isaiah left the whip wrapped around the stump of his shoulder. A gift. He was in the chapel, reading scripture by lamplight, mouthing verses he didn't understand. He looked up when the door creaked open and said, "Who goes there?" The door closed behind Isaiah like a coffin lid. Briggs stood, reaching for the rod hung on the wall. His whip, slender, dark, pious, he held it like a preacher's staff. "Isaiah, you listen to me now. Vengeance is the Lord's. Vengeance belongs—" The whip struck his throat before he could finish. Once. A clean, diagonal lash, the same kind he had delivered 1,000 times. Briggs staggered back, hands at his neck. Twice. The flesh split wider, blood pulsing between his fingers. Third time, Isaiah stepped forward and drew the whip across the man's face, tearing skin from jaw to brow. Briggs fell to his knees, whimpering, mottled red soaking into his black coat. Isaiah leaned close. "He that spareth the rod hateth his son," he whispered. "I hated you proper." Denton was last, the most dangerous, the quiet one. He found Isaiah before Isaiah found him, in the fields. The mist parted, and there he stood, tall, coat buttoned, eyes empty, whip in hand. "You think you different," Denton rasped. "You think you holy now." Isaiah didn't answer. Denton struck first, fast, cruel, aimed for the eyes. Isaiah ducked, rolled, felt the leather sing past his cheek. Another lash cracked across his ribs. He grunted, pain blossoming. Blood spilled from old wounds, opened anew, but Isaiah kept moving closer, low, like a panther in tall grass. Denton lunged. Isaiah caught the whip midair. They struggled, grunting, muscles straining, the leather stretching between them like a live snake. Isaiah grabbed Denton's wrist, twisted, crack. The bones snapped loud in the night. Denton screamed, dropped the whip. Isaiah slammed him to the dirt, fists, elbows, knees. Every part of Isaiah's body became weapon, then he took snakebite. Wrapped it around Denton's neck. But he didn't strangle him. He tied the man's arms behind his back, stripped him of his coat, then dragged him across the fields to the post where Samuel had died, to the place where Elijah bled. He tied him there, and then Isaiah dismembered him, not with a knife, but with the whips. He lashed and tore muscle from bone, layer by layer, until what was left of Denton was no longer a man, but a message. By the end, Isaiah was soaked head to toe in blood. His own, theirs, the field's. He stood alone, under the stars, and he whispered, "The field remembers." Some say that's all he said before disappearing into the mist. Others claim he collapsed, crying Samuel's name. Still others insist he walked away barefoot, carrying 4 broken whips in his hands like relics. But everyone agrees the gallows fields were never the same. And the sound of a whip cracking never again meant power. It meant reckoning. The sky, pale and trembling, did not greet the morning with bird call, but with silence. No overseers shouting, no whips cracking. No boots marching, just the wind brushing over the tobacco leaves, uneasy and whispering. And then someone screamed. Calloway's body was found first, hanging in the field, throat bound in his own whip, head swollen purple, eyes frozen wide in terror. His legs dangled just inches from the soil, as if the earth itself refused to take him. Harlan came next. The dogs led them to what was left, an arm twisted from its socket, rope marks cutting deep into dead flesh, chunks of meat missing. Drag marks led to the feed shed, where the rest of him slumped against the wall, blood soaked through straw like spilled paint. Briggs was discovered kneeling at the chapel steps, his throat gaping like a second mouth, pages of his blood-spattered Bible fluttering in the breeze. And Denton, God help them, was unrecognizable. Lashed beyond death, his limbs scattered at the old whipping post like a butchered ox. Someone had tied his shredded coat to the post, a mock flag rising with the wind. 4 men, 4 whips, 4 ends. They rode out at first light, pistols drawn, torches in hand. They searched cabins, barns, smokehouses. They rounded up every slave and barked questions they didn't want answers to. Who did this? Who saw anything? Who helped him? Not a soul spoke, not out of fear, but reverence. The slaves stood still, back straight, eyes lowered. But inside they were singing quietly, wordlessly, not songs of joy, songs of power. "Isaiah broke the whip," someone whispered. "He flipped the world," another murmured. "He turned pain into judgment." The masters didn't dare ask again. By sundown, the story had already begun to change. The white men, trembling, confused, invented lies. "Bandits," they claimed. "An ambush. Escaped criminals." One even said it was Indians come to settle old debts. They refused to believe it was Isaiah. Couldn't imagine a slave, one man, could do that to 4 seasoned overseers. It didn't fit their world, but they buried the bodies anyway. Quiet. No ceremony. And they buried the whips, too. One by one, they dug a shallow grave behind the barn. Into it, they tossed the leather tools like cursed relics, snakebite, red joy, the gospel rod, and Denton's notched devil coil. They covered them in earth and salt, lit candles, whispered prayers. But it wasn't enough, because the whips didn't stay buried. Each storm unearthed them, tips poking out from the mud like fingers clawing upward. The rain washed the dirt away, and the leather, stained and stiff, rose again like bones that refused to rot. The field hands began to avoid that patch, said the ground felt wrong, that it pulsed beneath their feet. That sometimes at night they heard the crack of a whip, far off, but near enough to chill the bone. Even the new overseers noticed. They brought in fresh men from Georgia, Carolina, Texas, but none stayed long. The first, a big man with a saber scar on his cheek, lasted 3 weeks before he packed his bags and left without a word. The second drank himself blind by day 5, muttering about eyes in the corn. A third tried to beat a boy for lagging. His hand broke mid-swing, no cause, no explanation. The masters grew quiet. Punishment slowed. Fear was in their eyes now, and in their silence, the slaves grew taller. They still toiled, still obeyed, but they did it with heads a little higher, with steps more certain. Because they knew what had happened, and the land did too. Isaiah was never seen again. Some say he ran, disappeared into the swamps south of the river, joined up with Maroons in the highland forests. They say he became a leader there, teaching others how to strike back. Others claim he died that same night, wounds too deep to survive. That he buried himself beneath the tree where his brother fell. But the ones who believe deepest say otherwise. They say he became something else. A spirit of vengeance tied to the land, that when mist curls low and the moon disappears, he walks the rows barefoot. That his blood still feeds the tobacco, that every crack of thunder is a whip remembering what it was made for. One boy, years later, found a carved figure in the dirt, twisted wood shaped like a man with whip handles for arms. He ran it back to his mother. She took one look and said, "Put it back. That don't belong to us. That's Isaiah's." And so the plantation changed. Not because the masters grew kind, but because they grew afraid. The field didn't forget. Neither did the wind, the rain, the red clay. And when the whips rose again, rusted and bleeding, they didn't cry for more blood. They sang of the one who broke them, Kentucky, 1887. The Hayworth plantation is no more. Its great house sits crumbling behind overgrown hedgerows, its shutters rotted, its chimneys hollowed out like blackened teeth. The fields lie fallow, thick with weeds and whispering cane that grows wild now, untended and angry. What once was industry is now ghostland. Locals refuse to walk its trails after sundown. Even the dogs won't chase rabbits into the thickets near the whipping post. Children cross themselves when wagons pass the northern fence. Preachers warn of unclean spirits that dwell in the bones of the land, and old-timers, those who remember, go silent when the wind picks up. Because when the wind blows just right, you don't hear birds, you hear whips. They say the sound is faint but sharp. A crack in the corn rows. A snap across the sugar cane. No hands hold it, just the leather curling through air like memory set free. Some say they've seen things. Rusted whips tied to trees, looped tight as if strangling the very bark, their ends coiled like snakes at rest. No one places them there. And if you try to cut them down, the metal screams, a shrill screech like steel on bone, enough to make grown men run. Others speak of a figure in the fields, tall, broad-shouldered, bare-chested, with a chest marked by scars that shimmer faint silver under moonlight. Some say his eyes glow like coal lit from inside, that he carries nothing, yet every step makes the sound of dragging chains. "Isaiah Fields," they whisper. "Come back." He is no longer a man in these stories. He is judgment made flesh. A spirit who watches over the children of the enslaved. Who punishes those who swing a belt too hard or raise a hand too fast? He is said to walk through the dreams of cruel men, lashing them in their sleep until they wake screaming. One white farmer who tried to rebuild the plantation claimed to have found a wooden figure buried beneath the porch, a man upside down, whip limbs, mouth sewn shut with thread. He burned it that night. By morning, his barn was ash. No fire was ever lit. After the war, many freedmen and women returned briefly to the area, looking for kin, for graves, for scraps of memory buried under years of brutality. They found pieces. Bent shackles in the creek, half-buried shoes in the cane rows, a stone with the letter S carved into it, nothing more. Some set up small homes nearby but wouldn't plant on the Hayworth land. "The soil's too red," they said. "Still bleeding." One elder, Mama Tilda, swore she saw Isaiah once in a lightning storm over the fields. She said he walked through the thunder like it was mist, arms stretched wide, 4 broken whips tied to his waist like a sash of vengeance. She died the next spring. Her last words were, "He didn't die, he bloomed." The stories changed shape with time, but never faded. Some said Isaiah rode a horse made of smoke and shadow. Others said he carried a bag filled with the tongues of overseers. One tale says he can be summoned. If you bury a whip in cursed soil, whisper a name, and bleed into the earth. But the core remained, a slave who turned the master's lash into the blade of freedom. A man who beat the whip with its own song. And that is how he survived, not in flesh, but in story, in warning, in myth. Children of the enslaved pass his tale down like a secret prayer. They don't speak it loud, only when needed. "You know what Isaiah did, right?" they whisper. "You know he's still watching." And still the whips rise. No matter how many are buried, no matter how deep, no matter the salt or fire. Every few years, one surfaces, a rusted coil poking through the mud. A leather strap wound around a fence post that wasn't there yesterday. Some so old they crumble at the touch, yet still sting in dreams. They say the plantation is cursed, but it ain't cursed. It's consecrated by blood, by memory, by wrath that had no tongue until Isaiah carved it with his silence. And so the legend stands. Of Isaiah Fields, the man who bore the lash until he became it. The man who took what was meant to break him and used it to break the world that owned it. The man who vanished into mist, but whose shadow still stretches long over the cane. And at night, when the wind moans low through the tobacco, when no animals stir, when the moon hides her face, you may hear it. Crack, not of punishment, not of power, but of vengeance remembering its name. And they say the leather remembers. The whip that drew blood now sings only of freedom. Isaiah Fields may be a legend, but the truth behind his story echoes through generations. How many names were never written, how many lashes never answered? If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep, drop a comment below saying, "The whip remembers." Let the algorithm know we don't forget, like the video to honor the untold. Share your thoughts or ancestral stories in the comments. Our channel is a place where memory lives on. Subscribe for more true and inspired tales of resistance, retribution, and reckoning. Because some whips may rust, but the stories, they never die.